CRS 313 Secret Project Intersection of Education and Immigration as it Affects Second Generation Americans. Hello again, everyone. I'm Eliza Wallace. I mentioned earlier in my bio that I moved from the Philippines and came to the US at the age of 18. So you can say that my siblings and I are the first generation in our family to grow up and graduate in college here in the United States. I was an 18-year-old Filipino student in my first year in a local college in Southern California. Both of my parents have a college degree in the Philippines. Going to college in the US for the very first time was a culture shock. I have never seen so much ethnicity, diversity, different cultural characteristics of group in my life. Going to college for me back then was so much pressure to do very well in school, setting an example to my younger siblings and succeeding to graduate college in America. Once I had my degree, the rest of my siblings followed. But the pressure was how the older one starts off. If I had started on the wrong foot, it's very hard to get the younger ones in the right track. I have seen that happen even to my relatives. With responsibility for tutoring shifting down the sibling line, my entire siblings became a mini school system. In the end, we were the first generation in our family who's fortunate to graduate college in America. My story is one of the many real-life stories illustrating diversity. Being a first generation to grow up and get a degree in the US is a life-changing experience. It is the stuff of which films, novels, and personal retrospectives have been made. After all, we live in a dynamic and complex American society. The different interactions with the racial, educational, and characteristics can produce very different adaptation outcomes. Therefore, the special needs to prepare the second-generation students can be a product of multiple ways, such as parental histories, the surrounding of U.S. contacts, the children-own development coming together, as well as the path that grows out of this confluence. Outline of presentation. What is first-generation immigrants? Let's define second-generation immigrants. What does the term one-and-a-half generation mean? I am considered as a one-and-a-half generation. Let's talk about the differences in the educational level between the second-generation immigrants and the first-generation immigrants in the United States. Let's also compare subgroups of the first and second-generation students to one another and to the overall undergraduate students population in higher education. In the outline presentation, let's talk about the differences in the income level between the first and the second generation immigrants. Also, the cultural things that we should consider. Are we meeting the needs of these students? What does ESL and EAL means? Next, what useful strategies for teachers with multinational classes can we use? Let's define the first generation immigrants. The term first generation, as it pertains to a person's nationality or residency in a country, can imply two possible meanings depending on context. A native-born citizen or resident of a country whose parents are foreign-born may be called a first-generation citizen. A foreign-born citizen or resident who has immigrated to a new country of residence may be called a first-generation migrant. The growing presence of first-generation immigrants in the United States has led to a growth in the percentage of the population that can be categorized as a second-generation Americans. Let's define second-generation immigrants. The term second generation extends the concept of first generation by one generation. The term second generation can refer to a member of either the second generation of a family to inhabit but the first natively born in a country, or the second generation born in a country. In the United States, second generation refers to the U.S.-born children of a foreign-born parents. In 2009, an estimate of 33 million people in the United States was second-generation immigrants, representing 11% of the national population. What does the term one-and-a-half generation means? I am considered as a one-and-a-half generation. The term one-and-a-half generation or 1.5G refers to individuals who immigrate to a new country before or during their early teens. They earn the label of one and a half generation because they bring with them or maintain characteristics from their own home country, meanwhile engaging in assimilation and socialization with their new country. Oftentimes, in the case of small children, a battle of linguistic comprehension occurs between their academic language and the language spoken at home. Their identity is a combination of a new and old culture and tradition. Depending on the age and immigration, the community where they settled, extent of education in their native country, and other factors, one and a half generation individuals identify with their countries of origin to varying degrees. Their identification is affected by their experiences growing up in their new country. One and a half G individuals are often bilingual and find it easier to assimilate into a local culture and society than people who immigrated as adults. Many one and a half generation also individuals becomes bicultural, combining both cultures, culture from the country of origin with the culture of the new country. Let's talk about the differences in the educational level between the second generation immigrants and the first generation population in the United States. Second generation immigrants are more educated compared to the first generation immigrants, exceeding parental education in many instances. A greater percentage of second generation immigrants have obtained a level of education beyond a high school diploma, with 59.2% having at least some college education in 2009. Also in 2009, 33% of the second generation immigrant population had a bachelor degree. Second generation immigrants are doing better overall and are assimilating more successful in U.S. society. Let's compare subgroups of first and second generation students to one another and to the overall undergraduate student population in higher education. The profile of immigrant and second generation American undergraduates is drawn from the 2007 and 2008 National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study. It compares subgroups of first and second generation students to one another and to the overall undergraduate student population in higher education. Overall, about 23% of college undergraduates were either immigrants themselves, which are 10%, or the children of first-generation immigrants, which are 13%. The proportion of college students who fell into those categories were much higher in some states than the others. For instance, in California and New York, first or second-generation immigrants made up 45 and 35% of all undergraduates, respectively, while the total was fewer than 15% in both Georgia and Minnesota. Hispanics made up by far the largest proportion of second-generation immigrant students at 41%, followed by white and Asian students. Asian accounted for proportions of immigrant students of about 30%. Let's talk about the differences in the income level between the second-generation immigrant population and the first-generation immigrant population in the United States. In comparison to first-generation immigrants, the second-generation immigrants are more likely to achieve higher earnings. In 2008, the median annual earning for second-generation immigrants were $42,297, while the median annual earning for the first-generation immigrants were only $32,631. In the same year, the U.S. Census Bureau found that the second-generation immigrants had higher earnings overall, with a 42% of the second-generation immigrants population earning above $50,000 compared to just 31% of the first-generation immigrant population. Second-generation immigrants are also less likely to live in poverty relative to their first-generation counterparts. Let's talk about the cultural things we should consider. There is a great deal of diversity in terms of ethnicities and races within the second immigration population. Hispanics, Asian American, and African American are the three of the major groups that makes up the population of the second generation immigrants in the United States. This diversity among immigrants can be seen in language use, as the majority of second-generation immigrants are bilingual, with two-thirds speaking a language other than English in their homes. Hispanics. In 2003, the Pew Research Center projected that in the next 20 years, second-generation Latinos will account for the largest percentage of the United States population. 1/7 of new students enrolling in schools within the same time period will also be second-generation Latinos. In relation to educational achievement, second-generation Latinos followed the general trend to far second-generation immigrants in the United States. In comparison to the first generation, the second-generation Latinos are more likely to intermarry with members of their other racial groups. These higher rates of racial intermarriage leads to an increase in the birth rates of interracial children, aiding in the elimination of disparities in the U.S. that exist along ethnic lines. Mexican Americans constitutes the largest percentage of second-generation immigrants in the United States. Among male high school graduates, the employment rates are comparable to those experienced by the native-born white. Asian Americans. 27% of the Asian population in the United States can be categorized as second-generation immigrants. The diversification of the pool of first-generation Asian immigrants, were mainly as highly as educated, plays a pivotal role in the assimilation of the second generation. Second-generation Asian immigrants are therefore more likely to be born into a middle-class family than second-generation immigrants from other racial groups. Asian second-generation immigrants, like their Hispanic counterparts, tend to be bilingual. Children of Asian immigrants are likely to lose proficiency in their parents' native language while maintaining an emotional attachment to their family and heritage, which helps them develop their identity. While second-generation Asian immigrants strive for the middle-class white status, as many of their parents do, they develop a sensitivity to the issue of race and ethnicity, which can be a major factor in the process of assimilation. African Americans. The identification of second-generation immigrants of the Caribbean heritage as African Americans can lead these children to be more aware of racial discrimination in the U.S. Racism is an important deterring factor to the process of assimilation for Black secondary-generation immigrants. Second-generation African American children make use of the resources available to the middle class in the U.S. to prosper alongside their white counterparts, but are still affected by racial discrimination. They make use of so-called the Black spaces, which are spaces exclusive to the Black community, such as networks and ethnic enclaves designed for African American. Thus, these spaces are free of racism and are used to connect with other African American and reconnect with the cultures of their parents. Are we meeting the needs of these students? Studies have revealed that second-generation immigrant students perform better in academic than the first-generation immigrant students. Second-generation immigrant students were found to outperform the first-generation students on standardized tests. This could be because the first-generation students work hard on their homework, but their limited English proficiency makes it difficult to understand test questions. For decades, researchers have pointed to a phenomenon known as the immigrant paradox, which meant that the second-generation immigrant kids starts to show risky behavior. They have more grit over successive generations. This immigrant advantage differs from community to community. Overall, we believe that immigrant students perform better likely because of their positive values. Immigrants compare their situation to those still living in their native country, allowing them to be positive about their situation, the sacrifices that their parents have made to give them a better life, as well as high expectations from parents, also motivate their achievements. What does ESL and EAL means? ESL, or English as Second Language, is a common abbreviation used in schools. Schools will often use the term ESL when describing the programs that educate students who are not native English speakers, and for describing the ESL student themselves. EAL. EAL means as English as an additional language. It means that English is taught to people who have moved to an English-speaking country and whose first language is not English, especially school children. EAL can also refer to English taught to all people whose first language is not English. What are useful strategies for teachers and multinational classes? It can be a challenge to teach students with ESL or EAL, even with the support in a classroom. I have volunteered a few times in my twin nephews' classroom when they were young, and I have some very amusing conversations with these students. Once I was trying to explain what a rabbit is, and I ended up having to act out as a rabbit by jumping along with my hands upright on my head pretending to be ears. The students thought it was hilarious, but understood. Having pictures prepared really helps. As I was teaching, I tried to use a lot of visuals in the students' discussion, translated keywords, sentence writing frames, and so on to help those students. From that experience, I do believe that teachers should have specific training, for it can be useful to develop strategies for scaffolding language for these students and provide opportunities for these young learners to practice their English. Pictures are one of the most used tools. Drawing or photographs can help students associate those objects with English word, no matter what their native language is. Repetition and demonstration are also among ESL teachers' primary teaching tools. Many ESL and EAL programs will also use computer softwares to help students learn English. For example, the Rosetta Stone series is a perfect example because students can progress through the lessons as they learn. I do believe that adult translator in school and on occasions are also necessary when teaching multinational classes. Sometimes these students need additional support through the process as their families have no prior experience to draw from. From my volunteer work, I found that offering opportunities for these young students to communicate with each other about their cultures, their origins, and background as part of their learning program is a very effective method of demonstrating respect for cultural diversities as well as making the most of the richness of what it offers.